The settlers mocked her dark skin and handed her over to the Comanche like livestock. Temperance Blackwood felt the rope burn her wrists as wagon master Jeremiah Colt lifted her onto the painted horse. The warrior's hands were surprisingly gentle. His face revealed nothing. "Take her," Colt said to the mounted figures. "She's worth more to you than us." Laughter rippled through the circled wagons. Martha Henley's voice cut sharpest above the rest. The sound followed Temperance as the horse wheeled away from everything she had known, everything that had barely tolerated her existence. The Comanche warrior who held her spoke no words. His chest rose and fell against her back as they rode. She waited for the knife, for the end. Instead, wind swept across endless grass. The sun burned overhead. Her captors rode in formation around her, silent as the approaching storm clouds. 2 weeks earlier, the Morrison wagon train had stretched across the Kansas territory like a scar on green earth. Temperance walked beside her purchased space in the supply wagon. Her coin had bought passage west. Nothing more. The other travelers made that clear with their sideways glances and whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. She carried her father's leather satchel close to her body. Inside lay instruments most of these people had never seen, knowledge they would never understand. Her father had taught her to read the language of sick animals, to understand their pain through touch and observation. He had also taught her when to hide such gifts. The horses began falling ill on the third day out of independence. First, the bay mare pulling the Henderson wagon, then two of Colt's riding stock. By the fifth day, half the animals moved with labored breathing and swollen joints. Colt gathered the men each evening to debate solutions. They spoke of bad water and cursed luck. None mentioned the obvious symptoms Temperance recognized from her father's teachings. None asked for her opinion. She waited until the camp settled into sleep before moving among the sick animals. Her hands found the swollen glands along their necks, their elevated temperatures, the particular way they favored their left front legs. She had seen this before. The willow bark grew thick along the creek beds. She harvested it by moonlight, grinding it between stones her father had taught her to carry. The poultice went on to the worst cases first. By morning, their breathing had eased. Young Tommy Morrison found her applying the treatment to his family's oxen. The boy watched with wide eyes as she worked the mixture into the animal's joints. "You're fixing him," he whispered. Temperance pressed a finger to her lips. The boy nodded and disappeared back to his bedroll. The next morning brought improvement in all the treated animals. Colt strutted between the wagons, claiming credit for his common-sense approach to livestock management. The other men nodded and praised his wisdom. Temperance kept her head down and said nothing, but she felt eyes on her as she worked. Not just Tommy's curious gaze, something else, something watching from the ridgelines that flanked their route. The Comanche appeared on the seventh day. 5 riders on painted horses, moving parallel to the wagon train but keeping their distance. They made no aggressive moves, showed no weapons, simply rode and watched. Colt posted guards and checked his rifle. The settlers pulled their children closer and muttered about savage intentions. Temperance noticed how the riders seemed more interested in the livestock than the people, how they pointed toward the recovering horses and spoke in low tones. On the 10th day, they came closer. The lead rider raised his hand in what might have been a peaceful gesture. He was older than the others, with silver streaking his braided hair and scars marking his weathered hands. "They want a trade," Colt announced to the gathered settlers. "Horse flesh for safe passage." Martha Henley stepped forward, her face pinched with suspicion. "How do we know they won't just take what they want anyway?" "Because they could have done that already," Colt replied, but his voice carried uncertainty. The negotiations took place in broken English and hand gestures. The Comanche leader seemed most interested in examining the recovered horses. He ran his hands along their legs, checking their breathing, testing their responses to pressure. His eyes found Temperance across the camp circle, held her gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or simply curiosity. That night, Martha Henley's whispers turned poisonous. She spoke of signals and secret communications, of unnatural alliances and dangerous loyalties. The other women listened and nodded. Fear bred suspicion. Suspicion bred accusations. "She's been signaling them," Martha declared the next morning. "Mark my words, she's in league with those savages." Temperance had done nothing, said nothing, made no gestures toward the distant riders, but truth mattered little when people needed someone to blame. Colt's gambling debts back in Independence had followed him west in the form of worried investors and unfulfilled promises. He needed solutions, quick ones, the kind that eliminated problems rather than solved them. The Comanche riders returned under a peace flag. Their leader spoke better English than he had initially revealed. He asked specifically about the horse sickness, about treatments and recovery methods. His questions were precise, informed. Martha Henley pointed directly at Temperance. "She's the one you want to ask. She's been watching your every move." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Colt saw his opportunity. The settlers saw their scapegoat. Temperance saw the trap closing around her. The rope came out before she could speak in her own defense. The Comanche camp emerged from prairie grass like something born from the earth itself. Hide lodges stretched in careful patterns around a central fire. Children played between the dwellings, their laughter carried on wind that smelled of sage and wood smoke. No one screamed. No one ran. Temperance had expected death. Instead, she found curious eyes and careful distance. The warrior who had taken her dismounted with fluid grace. His movements held no urgency, no violence. "You will not be harmed," he said in clear English. The words struck her harder than any blow. She had prepared for brutality. Kindness left her defenseless. He led her to a lodge painted with running horses. An elderly woman emerged, her weathered face kind but assessing. She gestured for Temperance to sit on a woven mat beside the entrance, brought water in a carved bowl, food that tasted of corn and prairie herbs. The warrior settled across from her. His presence filled the space between them without crowding it. "I am Soaring Hawk," he said. "You have knowledge of horse medicine." It was not a question. Temperance's hands found her father's satchel, still pressed against her ribs. The leather was warm from her body heat. "I might." He nodded toward the camp's edge, where a magnificent stallion stood tethered in shade. The animal's coat gleamed black with white markings that traced lightning patterns across his flanks. Even from a distance, Temperance could see the labored breathing, the way he held his left foreleg. "Wind runner," Soaring Hawk said. 3 days now. The same sickness that had struck the wagon train." Temperance felt her father's teaching stir in her mind. The symptoms painted themselves clearly against her memory. "You followed us because of the horses. Your people's animals recovered. Mine grows worse." Truth settled between them like dust after wind. The wagon train's betrayal took on new dimension. They had handed over their healer to save themselves from a man who only wanted to save his horse. Temperance studied Soaring Hawk's face. Lines mapped years of sun and weather around his eyes. Scars crossed his knuckles from work and war. His hands rested still on his knees, waiting. "I cannot promise success. You can promise to try." She followed him to Wind Runner's side. The stallion lifted his great head at their approach. His dark eyes held intelligence and pain in equal measure. Temperance extended her hand slowly, letting him catch her scent. His nostrils flared. His muscles tensed beneath midnight hide. Her fingers found the swollen glands, the elevated temperature, the telltale resistance when she tested the range of motion in his shoulder joint. Wind Runner stood patient under her examination, as though he understood her intent. "Willow bark," she said, "ground fine with prairie sage, applied as poultice and given internally with water." Soaring Hawk's eyes never left her hands as she worked. His attention held the weight of desperate hope carefully concealed. This horse meant more than transportation, more than wealth. The animal carried part of his soul. She prepared the medicine as her father had taught her. Ground the bark between stones worn smooth by generations of use. mixed it with water drawn from the creek that ran silver through camp. The paste felt familiar between her fingers, her father's knowledge flowing through her hands into healing. Wind Runner accepted the treatment with dignity that matched his owner's. The poultice went on warm. The liquid medicine disappeared without struggle. Temperance felt the animal's breathing ease slightly under her touch. 2 days, she told Soaring Hawk. Maybe 3 before we know. He nodded once. Led her back to the lodge where the elderly woman waited with evening food. The camp settled around them as darkness claimed the prairie. Fires bloomed between the dwellings. Voices carried stories and laughter through the cooling air. Temperance lay on soft robes, staring at stars visible through the smoke hole above. The sounds of this place differed from anything she had known. No bitter whispers, no sideways glances, no careful distance maintained because of her skin. The second day brought improvement. Wind Runner moved with less pain. His breathing deepened. The swelling in his joints began to recede. Soaring Hawk's relief showed only in the way his shoulders lost their rigid set, the way he lingered near the stallion's side. Other horses were brought to her, a mare with similar symptoms, a gelding favoring his hind legs. Temperance treated them all, her confidence growing with each success. Her father's teachings proved their worth in this place where knowledge mattered more than the color of hands that held it. Women approached with shy curiosity, brought their children to watch her work, asked questions in broken English about plant medicines and animal care. Their interest held no mockery, no suspicion, only genuine desire to learn. Young warriors tested her knowledge with challenges that bordered on respect. Could she tell why a horse refused to take weight on sound legs? Could she read the signs of colic before they became dangerous? Each correct answer earned nods of approval. Soaring Hawk taught her words in his language, names for plants and animals, phrases for greeting and gratitude. His voice held patience when she struggled with unfamiliar sounds, encouragement when she succeeded. On the third day, Wind Runner galloped. The stallion burst from stillness to full speed in heartbeats. His hooves drummed thunder against packed earth. His mane streamed banner-proud in prairie wind. He ran for the joy of running, for the simple pleasure of muscles that obeyed and lungs that drew clean air without pain. Soaring Hawk's smile transformed his weathered features, made him younger, made him human in ways Temperance had not expected. "You have given me back my brother," he said. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Wind Runner represented more than property or transportation. He was companion, partner, extension of soul made flesh. That evening, the camp celebrated with feast and dancing. Drums spoke rhythms older than memory. Voices rose in songs that honored healing and the woman who had brought it. Temperance sat beside Soaring Hawk, watching children play in firelight, feeling something she had never dared name: belonging. But even in celebration, she caught glimpses of concern in adult faces, heard fragments of conversation that carried worry. The outside world pressed against this sanctuary with increasing weight. Change rode the wind from eastern territories where white settlement grew thick as summer grass. Soaring Hawk felt her attention shift to these undercurrents of tension. "Army patrols," he said quietly, "more each week. They push all tribes toward designated lands." Reservation. The word hung unspoken between them. Temperance understood its implications. This freedom she had found carried an expiration date written in government policy and military pressure. How long? Not long enough. The fire crackled lower as night deepened. Around them, families settled into lodges. Children's voices faded to whispers, then silence. Temperance felt the weight of temporary sanctuary. The knowledge that morning would bring reality closer to their peaceful circle of firelight and acceptance. But for now, Wind Runner grazed content in moonlight. Her hands held skills valued by people who saw her worth. Soaring Hawk sat beside her in comfortable silence, their shared burden of an uncertain future creating bonds stronger than words. The weeks passed like water through cupped hands. Each dawn brought Temperance deeper into rhythms she had never known existed. Women taught her to braid sweetgrass and prepare hide for winter clothing. Children showed her which berries grew safe along the creek banks. Their acceptance came without conditions or careful qualifications. She worked among the horses each morning. Her reputation spread to neighboring camps. Warriors rode long distances to bring sick animals for her touch. Each successful healing added weight to her standing. Each grateful nod from a horse owner built something she had never possessed: respect. Soaring Hawk found reasons to linger near her work. He brought wild mint for the horses' water, carried her satchel when they walked to gather medicines. His presence felt steady as creek stones beneath running water, reliable in ways she had forgotten were possible. They spoke of plants and healing, of horse bloodlines and weather patterns, of everything except the growing tenderness that sparked between their careful words. The way his hand brushed hers when passing tools, how her pulse quickened when he smiled. But the outside world cast long shadows even into their protected valley. Dust clouds appeared on distant ridges, army patrols scouting water sources and camping grounds, government surveyors measuring land for division and ownership. The future pressed closer with each passing day. Young warriors gathered in heated councils. Their voices carried anger that burned bright and dangerous. They spoke of fighting, of driving the invaders back beyond the great river, of dying free rather than living caged. Soaring Hawk listened to their fury with the patience of falling snow. His words when he spoke held weight that cooled their fire without extinguishing their courage. "A dead warrior protects no one," he told them. "Our children need fathers who breathe." The older men nodded agreement. They remembered previous wars. The cost of resistance measured in empty lodges and silent cook fires. But the young ones burned with righteousness that would not be easily contained. Temperance felt the tension building toward violence she could not prevent. This sanctuary that had welcomed her stood on ground that would soon be contested. Her presence complicated decisions that would determine survival. One morning she woke to find Soaring Hawk already gone. Wind Runner's tether rope hung empty in the pre-dawn darkness. She dressed quickly and walked to the creek, where mist rose from water that reflected the brightening sky. He sat on the bank with his feet bare in the current. Wind Runner grazed nearby, his coat dark with dew. The stallion raised his head at her approach, nickering soft recognition. "The scouts returned," Soaring Hawk said without turning. "3 columns of cavalry, moving this direction." Temperance lowered herself to the grass beside him. The water ran clear over smooth stones. Small fish darted between shadows and sunlight. Everything appeared peaceful, normal. The lie of surface calm over deeper currents. How long? Days, maybe a week if they stopped to map the territory. She studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way morning light caught silver threads in his black hair. He had given her something precious in these weeks, a glimpse of who she might be if the world judged her by her worth instead of her skin. "What will you tell them?" "That we want peace. That we will consider their terms for relocation." His voice held no conviction. They both understood that consideration was not acceptance, that terms offered by men with guns were not really negotiations. "The young warriors will not agree." "No, they will not." Wind Runner splashed into the creek, lowering his great head to drink. The stallion's presence reminded them both of what was at stake. Not just land or freedom, but ways of life that stretched back generations. Relationships between people and animals that could not be preserved on reservations designed by men who understood neither. Soaring Hawk finally looked at her. His dark eyes held depth she was still learning to read. "You could leave," he said. "Return to your people before the soldiers arrive." The suggestion struck her harder than any physical blow. Her people. As if she belonged anywhere in the white world that had discarded her. As if safety waited beyond the boundaries of this place that had become home. "These are my people." The words emerged before she could examine them, before she could measure their implications or consider safer alternatives. But they felt true in ways that surprised her. Soaring Hawk's hand found hers. His calloused fingers intertwined with hers, creating warmth that spread up her arm and settled near her heart. The path ahead will be difficult. Most worthwhile paths are. They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher. Wind Runner finished drinking and moved to graze closer to their position. Other horses from the camp herd appeared along the creek, their morning routine undisturbed by human worries about an uncertain future. But even peaceful moments carried undertones of change. Temperance noticed how Soaring Hawk's attention drifted to the eastern horizon, how his free hand rested near the knife at his belt. Habits formed by years of leadership in dangerous times. The camp stirred to life behind them. Cook fires bloomed with breakfast preparations. Children's voices rose in greeting to the new day. Dogs barked at imagined threats. All the sounds of normal morning activity in a world that would soon be anything but normal. "There is something else," Soaring Hawk said. His voice carried weight that made her turn to face him fully. "The cavalry captain. The scouts recognized him from previous encounters. He speaks our language well, knows our customs. This will not be a simple demand for surrender." Temperance felt ice form in her stomach. Reasonable negotiations were often more dangerous than outright hostility. They offered the illusion of choice while leading toward predetermined conclusions. "He will want to meet with you, as war leader and spokesman for the band." "Yes, I should not be present. My presence would complicate any discussions." Soaring Hawk's grip on her hand tightened, not painfully, but with emphasis that spoke louder than words. "Your presence is the only thing that makes discussion worthwhile." The admission hung between them heavier than morning mist. It carried implications that frightened her more than cavalry columns or uncertain futures. He was not just offering partnership in facing what was coming. He was offering partnership in whatever came after. Wind Runner lifted his head from grazing, ears pricked toward the camp. His alertness communicated itself to the other horses. They turned as one toward some disturbance Temperance could not yet perceive. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats approaching from the east. Multiple riders moving at steady pace across prairie grass. Not the thundering approach of attack, but the measured advance of official business. Soaring Hawk rose smoothly to his feet, extended his hand to help her stand. Around them, the peaceful morning transformed into something charged with possibility and danger. The cavalry had arrived ahead of schedule. Temperance looked toward the camp where people emerged from lodges to assess this new development. Children were called close to their mothers. Men gathered near the council fire with weapons close at hand but not displayed. She felt the weight of choice settling on her shoulders. Stay and face whatever was coming. Run and preserve the safety she had never really possessed. Or find some third option that honored both survival and the bond she had built in this place. Soaring Hawk waited beside her, patient as stone, steady as the creek that ran between its banks regardless of what storms might come. Captain Samuel Wade rode into camp with 5 soldiers and the confidence of a man backed by government authority. His uniform bore the dust of hard travel, but his bearing remained crisp, military precision in every gesture. His eyes swept the assembled Comanche with practiced assessment before settling on Soaring Hawk. "I seek the war leader of this band." Soaring Hawk stepped forward. His movement drew the captain's attention like iron to lodestone. The two men studied each other across cultural and political divides that measured wider than the creek between them. "I am Soaring Hawk. Captain Wade, United States Army. I come under orders to discuss relocation to designated territories." The formal words carried familiar weight. Temperance had heard similar language, used to move freed slaves from place to place, according to white convenience. Bureaucratic courtesy that masked non-negotiable demands. She remained at the edge of the gathering, hoping her presence would pass unnoticed. Her father's satchel pressed against her ribs, a reminder of knowledge that had brought her acceptance here but might prove dangerous in military hands. Wade's gaze moved methodically through the crowd, cataloging faces, assessing potential threats. His attention paused on her for a heartbeat longer than the others. Something flickered in his expression before moving on. The Great Father in Washington offers good land near Fort Sill, Wade continued. Rich grass for your horses, protection from white settlers who might cause trouble, protection from trouble they would cause. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Soaring Hawk's response came measured and careful. We would hear these terms. Of course, but first let us speak privately, leader to leader. The captain dismounted with fluid grace. His soldiers remained mounted, hands resting casually near their weapons, not threatening but ready. The message was clear enough. Soaring Hawk led Wade toward the council lodge. The crowd began to disperse, but Temperance caught the captain's sharp glance back in her direction. Recognition sparked in his eyes. Her stomach turned to ice. The negotiations continued through the long afternoon. Voices rose and fell behind hide walls while the camp waited in tense silence. Women kept children close. Men cleaned weapons they hoped not to use. Everyone understood that their future was being decided by men who saw them as problems requiring solutions. Temperance tended horses near the creek, trying to lose herself in familiar work. Her hands moved through routine tasks while her mind raced through possibilities. All of them ended badly. Wind Runner nuzzled her shoulder, sensing her distress. She buried her fingers in his dark mane, drawing comfort from his solid presence. This horse had brought her to Soaring Hawk's attention, had earned her a place among people who valued her skills over her skin color. Magnificent animal. Captain Wade's voice made her spin around. He approached alone, having left the council lodge during some break in proceedings. His pale eyes held calculation that made her skin crawl. He was sick when I first saw him, Wade continued conversationally. Amazing recovery, almost like someone knew exactly how to treat that particular ailment. Temperance said nothing, kept her hand on Wind Runner's neck for support. You're Temperance Blackwood, daughter of Marcus Blackwood, the horse doctor. The name hit her harder than any physical blow. She had not heard her father spoken of in years, had tried to bury his memory deep enough to stop the pain of his loss. Don't know what you mean. Your father was famous in certain circles, treated cavalry mounts at 3 different forts before he got uppity ideas about his place in the world. The casual cruelty in Wade's tone ignited anger in her chest. Her father had been murdered for the crime of excellence, for healing animals better than white men could manage. He was a good man. He was a dead man the moment he forgot his station, just like his daughter will be if she doesn't remember hers. The threat hung between them heavy as storm clouds. Wade stepped closer, invading the space that separated them. There are warrants out for you in 3 territories. Suspicion of inciting unrest, theft of medical supplies, practicing veterinary medicine without proper authority. Lies built on the foundation of her father's reputation. Charges designed to give legal weight to whatever Wade intended. But I'm a reasonable man, the captain continued, willing to overlook past indiscretions in exchange for future cooperation. What kind of cooperation? Information about Comanche horse breeding programs, their traditional grazing routes, locations of winter camps and water sources, details that would help the Army manage their transition to reservation life. Management, another word that disguised darker intentions. Wade wanted her to betray everything she had learned during her time with Soaring Hawk's people. I don't have that information. You've been living among them for weeks, treating their animals, earning their trust. Don't insult my intelligence. Wind Runner shifted restlessly, responding to the tension crackling between the humans. His movement reminded Temperance of how much she had to lose. Not just her own safety, but the bonds she had built with people who had shown her kindness. And if I refuse, then you'll be arrested as a fugitive, transported back to Kansas for trial. Your friends here will lose their animal doctor right when they need her most. The choice was no choice at all. Cooperation meant betraying people who had given her sanctuary. Refusal meant abandoning them to face relocation without the skills that had made her valuable. Wade smiled at her silence. He understood the trap he had constructed. Think about it tonight. I want your answer before we resume negotiations tomorrow. He walked away with the satisfied stride of a man certain of victory. Temperance remained beside Wind Runner, feeling the walls of her temporary freedom collapse around her. That evening, she sat with Soaring Hawk beside the creek where they had shared so many peaceful moments. The water ran dark under starlight. Night sounds carried the illusion of normalcy over currents of approaching change. Wade knows who I am. Soaring Hawk's stillness spoke volumes. He had suspected complications might arise from her presence during negotiations. He wants information about your people, in exchange for my freedom. And if you refuse, arrest, trial, probably execution for crimes I didn't commit. The brutal truth settled between them like creek stones, heavy and unmovable. Soaring Hawk picked up a smooth pebble and turned it over in his weathered hands. His touch was gentle despite the calluses that marked years of hard work and harder choices. I will not ask you to sacrifice yourself for us. You're not asking, I'm choosing. But even as she spoke the words, Temperance felt their inadequacy. Choosing required real alternatives. Wade had constructed a situation where every path led toward loss. There might be another way, she said slowly. The idea formed as she spoke it, dangerous and uncertain but possibly viable. I could return with him, work inside the system to negotiate better terms for your relocation, use whatever influence my skills might provide. Soaring Hawk's hand stilled on the pebble. His profile was unreadable in the darkness. That path leads through territory more dangerous than any cavalry charge. Most worthwhile paths do. She had used his own words against him. He smiled despite the gravity of their situation. The risk would be entirely yours. If you were discovered working both sides, neither would protect you. Then, I won't be discovered. The confidence in her voice surprised them both. Weeks of finding her place among the Comanche had rebuilt something in her that years of hiding had nearly destroyed. The willingness to fight for what mattered instead of simply surviving. Soaring Hawk rose and walked to the water's edge. He stood motionless for long minutes, weighing options that all carried terrible costs. If you do this thing, he said finally, you may not be able to return here. I know. You may have to become someone else entirely, live among people who see you as less than human. I've done it before. The admission carried more pain than she had intended to reveal. Soaring Hawk turned to face her, his expression holding understanding and something deeper that made her heart race. You have given me back my brother, he said, echoing his words about Wind Runner. Now let me give you something in return. He walked back to her side, knelt in the grass that cushioned the creek bank, took her hands in his with reverence that made her breath catch. The knowledge that you are loved, completely, without condition or reservation. Whatever happens in the days ahead, carry that truth with you. The words broke something loose in her chest. Tears she had held back for weeks finally spilled over. He pulled her close, and she buried her face against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of sage smoke and leather that had become home. Tomorrow she would begin walking the dangerous line between two worlds. Tonight she allowed herself to grieve for the sanctuary she was leaving behind. The ride back to Fort Garrison stretched across 2 days of scorching prairie. Temperance sat her borrowed horse with military precision, playing the part of cooperative informant while her heart remained tied to the camp she had left behind. Wade's soldiers flanked her like an honor guard or a prison escort. The fort materialized from heat shimmer and dust, adobe walls baked white under relentless sun, corrals full of cavalry mounts that stamped and snorted in the oppressive heat. The smell of horses mixed with leather and human sweat into something that reminded her of her father's world. Wade deposited her in quarters befitting her supposed status as consulting expert. A small room with actual walls and a window that looked out over the exercise yard. Luxury after weeks in hide lodges, but it felt like a cage painted in military colors. You'll begin work tomorrow, Wade informed her. Colonel Morrison wants to meet you first. Morrison. The name struck her like cold water. She had traveled west with the Morrison wagon train, had been betrayed by people who bore that name. The coincidence seemed too sharp to be accidental. The colonel proved to be a weathered man with intelligent eyes and hands that moved with economic precision. He examined her credentials with the thoroughness of someone who understood the value of expertise in hostile territory. "Your father's reputation precedes you," he said. "Marcus Blackwood saved more cavalry horses than any man in 3 territories." Pride and pain warred in her chest. Her father's legacy lived on in places she had never expected. The irony cut deep. White men honored his memory while murdering him for exceeding their expectations. "I try to follow his teachings. Captain Wade tells me you've been treating Comanche horses, observing their methods." The trap yawned before her feet. One wrong word would expose her true loyalties and end any chance of helping Soaring Hawk's people. "I've seen some of their techniques. Mostly they rely on plant medicines I'm familiar with." Morrison nodded approvingly. He led her to the window overlooking the main corral where dozens of horses milled in afternoon heat. "We lose more animals to disease than combat. If you can improve our treatment success, you'll have my full support for whatever arrangements Captain Wade has proposed." Support from the commanding officer. The kind of influence that could reshape negotiations if properly leveraged. Temperance felt the first stirring of hope since leaving the Comanche camp. She began work immediately. The fort's horses suffered from familiar ailments made worse by overcrowding and poor ventilation. Respiratory infections that could be treated with steam inhalations. Joint problems that responded to massage and herbal poultices. Basic care that had been overlooked in favor of complicated solutions. Her success rate drew attention from officers who had grown accustomed to losing valuable mounts. Within a week, she had established herself as indispensable. Morrison began consulting her on horse purchases and breeding decisions. But the real work happened in shadows and stolen moments. Messages passed through channels she carefully constructed. Trading post operators who moved between military and tribal territories. Mixed-blood interpreters who owed loyalty to both worlds. A network of communication that allowed her to stay connected to Soaring Hawk despite the distance. The negotiations proceeded slowly. Wade pressed for total relocation, while tribal representatives argued for partial concessions. Traditional grazing rights in exchange for accepting reservation boundaries. Access to sacred sites in return for peaceful cooperation. Each point required careful balance between military demands and tribal survival. Temperance used her growing influence to advocate for treaty provisions that would preserve Comanche horse culture. Adequate grazing land. Permission to maintain breeding programs. Recognition of traditional veterinary knowledge. Small victories that added up to meaningful protections, but Wade grew suspicious of her advocacy. His questions became sharper, his surveillance more obvious. He sensed divided loyalties beneath her cooperative surface. The crisis came during a staff meeting where Colonel Morrison praised her contribution to improved horse health. Wade's pale eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity. "Perhaps Miss Blackwood could share some of the Comanche secrets she's observed," he suggested. "Traditional weaknesses in their horse management we could exploit." The room fell silent. Officers leaned forward expectantly. Morrison nodded encouragement. The trap Wade had been constructing finally sprang shut around her. "I'm not sure I understand," she said carefully. "Their horses must have vulnerabilities, bloodline weaknesses, seasonal patterns that would make them easier to capture or disable during military operations." He wanted her to provide intelligence that would cripple the very people who had given her sanctuary. Information that would strip away their mobility and leave them helpless against military pressure. Temperance felt sweat gather between her shoulder blades despite the room's coolness. Every eye in the room watched her response. Morrison's expression showed growing concern at her hesitation. "The Comanche are excellent horsemen," she said finally. "Their animals are healthy and well-trained. I saw no obvious weaknesses to exploit." Wade's smile turned predatory. He had pushed her to reveal her true loyalties in front of witnesses. How disappointing. I had hoped for more useful observations from someone who lived among them for weeks. The accusation hung in the air heavy as smoke from a grass fire. Morrison's face darkened with understanding. The other officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "Captain Wade," Morrison said slowly, "perhaps you could explain what you mean by lived among them." "Miss Blackwood was captured by the Comanche several weeks ago, or so she claims. Her integration into their community was remarkably smooth for a prisoner." The carefully constructed narrative of her expertise began crumbling around her feet. Wade had maneuvered her into an impossible position where any defense would sound like confession. "I was treated well," she said. "They needed medical help for their horses. I provided it in exchange for safety." "How convenient," Wade replied, almost as if the arrangement had been planned in advance. Morrison stood and moved to the window. His silence stretched taut as bowstring while he weighed implications and loyalties. When he turned back to face the room, his expression had hardened into military resolve. "Miss Blackwood, you'll confine yourself to quarters until we can sort out these allegations." House arrest disguised as protective custody. Wade had succeeded in neutralizing her influence while maintaining the appearance of proper procedure. But that evening brought unexpected opportunity. A commotion in the main corral drew attention away from her quarters. Colonel Morrison's prize stallion had fallen critically ill. The fort's regular veterinarian stood helpless, while the animal's condition deteriorated rapidly. A desperate orderly appeared at her door with Morrison's direct request for assistance. The colonel's desperation had overcome his suspicion. She followed the soldier across the compound to where Morrison waited beside his suffering horse. The stallion showed symptoms of acute colic, potentially fatal without immediate intervention. Temperance knelt beside the animal and began her examination while Morrison watched with barely controlled anxiety. "Can you save him?" "Maybe, if we act quickly." She worked through the night with Morrison holding lanterns and following her instructions. The treatment required delicate balance between aggressive intervention and patient observation, skills her father had taught her during countless midnight emergencies. By dawn, the stallion was standing. By afternoon, he was grazing. By evening, Morrison had rescinded her confinement and restored her advisory position. Wade's fury simmered beneath military courtesy. His carefully constructed trap had backfired, leaving her more valuable than before. But she could see calculation in his pale eyes. He was already planning his next move. The final negotiations were scheduled for the following week. Representatives from 3 Comanche bands would gather at the fort to hear formal treaty terms. Soaring Hawk would be among them. Temperance had one last chance to influence the outcome. One final opportunity to ensure the agreements included provisions that would allow his people to survive with dignity. But Wade was watching her every move, waiting for any sign of the divided loyalty he knew she carried. The next mistake would be her last. She spent the remaining days walking the careful line between helpfulness and betrayal, offering advice that improved military horse care, while secretly working to preserve protections for Comanche horse culture in the coming treaty. The balance felt precarious as morning frost on autumn grass, beautiful and fragile and certain to disappear when the sun rose high enough to melt the illusion of stability. The Comanche delegation arrived at dawn on the day of final negotiations. Soaring Hawk rode Wind Runner at the head of the procession, his presence commanding respect even within military territory. The stallion's coat gleamed black in morning light, testament to the healing that had brought temperance into their lives. She watched from her quarters window as the riders approached the main gate. Her heart hammered against her ribs when Soaring Hawk's eyes found hers across the compound. The briefest nod passed between them. Recognition waited with all the words they could not speak. Wade positioned himself at Morrison's right hand during the formal proceedings. His attention never strayed far from Temperance despite her official role as veterinary consultant. He sensed the undercurrents flowing between her and the Comanche leader. The treaty terms were harsh but not impossible. Relocation to designated lands in exchange for peace. surrender of traditional hunting grounds in return for government provisions, the slow death of a people disguised as generous accommodation. Temperance listened from her position along the wall, noting which provisions could be improved and which represented non-negotiable demands. Her weeks among Morrison's staff had taught her to read military priorities. Some concessions could be won through careful pressure. During the midday recess, she approached Morrison with suggestions framed as improvements to horse management clauses. The Comanche were renowned horsemen. Preserving their breeding knowledge would benefit both sides. Traditional grazing rights would maintain animal health during transition periods. Morrison found merit in her arguments. The afternoon session included amendments that preserved crucial elements of Comanche horse culture. Small victories that might allow survival of larger traditions. But Wade was not fooled by the veterinary justifications. When the formal sessions ended, he cornered her in the empty meeting room. "Very clever," he said, "using horse welfare to protect your friends. I don't know what you mean. Every amendment you suggested benefits the Comanche more than the army. Someone might think you care more about their welfare than your own country's interests." The accusation carried deadly weight in military territory. Treason was not forgiven, especially from someone whose loyalty had already been questioned. "I care about good treaties that will keep the peace." Peace. Wade tasted the word as if it were poison. "Is that what you call your arrangement with their war leader?" Heat flooded her cheeks despite her efforts at control. Wade's smile turned predatory at her reaction. "I've seen how he looks at you, how you watch him. Touching, really. Too bad it won't survive what's coming next." "What do you mean?" "The treaty includes provisions for monitoring compliance. I'll be stationed at their new reservation as military liaison, observing their adjustment to civilized life." The threat was clear. Wade would use his position to make life impossible for Soaring Hawk's people. Any excuse would justify harsh measures against natives who failed to adapt quickly enough. "You can't persecute them for existing. I can enforce treaty compliance with whatever measures seem necessary. Unless, of course, someone with influence were to advocate for a different approach." Another trap. Wade wanted her cooperation in oppressing the people she had worked to protect. Her influence with Morrison could be turned toward cruelty instead of mercy. What kind of cooperation? The kind that recognizes where your real loyalties should lie. With your own people instead of savages who would scalp you given the chance. The casual hatred in his voice ignited something fierce in her chest. These were not savages. They were people who had shown her more kindness than she had ever received from her own race. "My answer is no." Wade's expression hardened into military stone. He had expected eventual capitulation, not outright defiance. "Then you'll be arrested tonight on charges of treason and conspiracy. Your Comanche friends will learn what happens to those who corrupt decent white women." The threat extended beyond her safety to Soaring Hawk and his people. Wade would use her arrest to justify breaking the treaty before the ink dried. She felt the walls closing around all of them. But desperation bred clarity. Wade's vindictiveness had revealed his weakness. He needed her corruption to justify his actions. Without her cooperation, his persecution would appear arbitrary and brutal. "Colonel Morrison might have different ideas about my loyalty, especially after I saved his horse. Morrison follows orders from Washington, and Washington doesn't appreciate traitors. Then let Washington judge my actions." She walked out of the room before Wade could respond. Her heart hammered with terrified courage, but her steps remained steady. Outside, the sun was setting over prairie grass that stretched toward horizons where free people still rode their own horses across their own land. The final confrontation came that evening. Wade appeared at Morrison's quarters with documents that detailed her suspected treachery. Circumstantial evidence woven into a narrative of betrayal and corruption. Morrison read the charges with growing concern. When he finished, his eyes held disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "These are serious accusations, Miss Blackwood." "Yes, sir, they are. Captain Wade believes you've been working against American interests." providing aid and comfort to potential enemies. I've been working for a just peace that honors the treaty we signed today, by advocating for Comanche interests over military ones. The moment balanced on a knife edge. Morrison's decision would determine not just her fate but the future of Wade's persecution plans. Sir, I've served this fort by saving cavalry horses and improving our treatment success. I've helped negotiate a treaty that secures peace without requiring total war. If that's treason, then I'm guilty. Morrison studied her face in the lamplight. He was a soldier, but also a man who understood the difference between duty and cruelty. Captain Wade, these charges are based largely on speculation and personal suspicion. Miss Blackwood's service to this fort has been exemplary. Her contributions to the treaty negotiations appear to have been beneficial to both sides. Wade's face flushed with frustrated rage. Colonel, you're making a mistake. This woman is dangerous. The only danger I see is the risk of losing a valuable asset to paranoia and prejudice. Miss Blackwood, I'm hereby appointing you to the position of cultural liaison to the Comanche reservation. Your job will be to ensure smooth implementation of treaty provisions. The appointment struck Wade speechless. Morrison had not only refused to arrest her, but had given her official authority to protect the people she cared about. 6 months later, Temperance rode across prairie grass toward the boundary between military territory and Comanche lands. The treaty had held. The relocation had proceeded without violence. Wade had been transferred to a fort in Arizona after several complaints about his harsh treatment of reservation natives. Soaring Hawk waited for her at the agreed meeting place. He sat Wind Runner with the same quiet dignity she remembered from their first encounter. But now his eyes held warmth that made her pulse quicken. She dismounted and walked to his side. He slipped down from the stallion's back and stood before her, close enough to touch but separated by months of careful distance. "The treaty holds," she said, "because of your work. Our work. You taught me that some things are worth fighting for. And you taught me that fighting sometimes means building bridges instead of burning them." He reached for her hands. His calloused fingers intertwined with hers, creating warmth that spread through her entire body. "I have something to ask you," he said. "Ask. Will you marry me, not just as liaison between our peoples, but as partner in whatever comes next?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Marriage would complicate her official position, would require navigating prejudices from both cultures, would mean choosing love over safety in a world that punished such choices. Yes, the word emerged before she could examine its implications, but it felt right in ways that surprised her with their certainty. Soaring Hawk smiled and pulled her close. She breathed in the familiar scent of sage and leather that meant home. Around them, prairie grass bent before wind that carried the promise of seasons yet to come. "You gave me more than those settlers ever could," she said against his chest. "What did I give you?" "Everything. Respect, purpose, love. The courage to be who I was meant to be instead of who the world expected. Then we are even, because you gave me the same." They stood together as the sun set over land that belonged to both of them now. The boundary line ran beneath their feet, but they had learned to live in the spaces between worlds, to build something new from the fragments of what had been broken. Wind Runner grazed nearby, his presence a reminder of the healing that had brought them together. In the distance, smoke rose from cook fires where children played and elders told stories that would preserve memory for generations yet to come. Temperance felt the weight of choice settling into peace. She had found her place at last, not in either world separately, but in the bridge she had built between them, in the love that had grown strong enough to span any distance. The future would bring challenges. There would be those who questioned their union and others who tried to break the treaties they had helped create. But they would face those trials together, with the knowledge that some bonds prove stronger than the forces that seek to break them. As darkness claimed the prairie, they mounted their horses and rode toward the reservation where their people waited, two worlds becoming one in the space between heartbeats. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.